My bank blocked my Bitcoin purchase. Not declined my card. Blocked the transaction, flagged my account, and sent me a letter telling me they had concerns about the transfer. I was not trying to do anything illegal. I was trying to buy Bitcoin on a regulated, publicly listed exchange using money I had earned and deposited in my own account. So I called them, and the conversation that followed told me more about how traditional finance views Bitcoin than any article I had ever read. I'm Sats, and this is what my bank actually said and what it reveals. Let me tell you how it started, because the context matters. I had been buying Bitcoin in relatively small amounts for a while, small enough that it had never triggered anything. Then I decided to make a larger purchase, a meaningful amount by my standards. I initiated the bank transfer to the exchange, and within a few hours my bank sent me a notification. Transaction blocked. Please call us. I called. The person on the other end was professional and not unkind. They explained that the transaction had been flagged by their fraud prevention system. They said transfers to cryptocurrency exchanges were in a high-risk category for their institution. They asked me to confirm I was making the transfer willingly and that I understood the risks. I said yes. I said I had been buying Bitcoin for 2 years. I said the exchange was regulated by the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network in the United States and was publicly listed. They acknowledged all of this. I explained that the exchange was a registered money services business subject to FinCEN requirements and was publicly listed on a major U.S. stock exchange. I asked them to explain exactly what category this fell under in their risk framework, and this is where the conversation got interesting. The representative explained that their institution had implemented enhanced due diligence on transfers to digital asset platforms following guidance they had received from their compliance department. She used phrases like elevated fraud risk and customer protection measures. When I pressed on what specific fraud risk they were protecting me from, the answer was vague. Something about scams involving cryptocurrency. When I pointed out that the exchange I was using was not a scam, she acknowledged that but said the policy applied to the category of platform, rather than to specific platforms individually. And that is when I realized something. They were not saying my transaction was risky, they were saying Bitcoin was risky. My specific purchase from my specific account to a specific regulated exchange was irrelevant. What mattered was the category. The bank was not blocking my transaction because they had identified a specific risk with this specific transfer. They were applying a blanket policy to an entire category of financial activity because that category is statistically associated with fraud in their risk models. That is not unreasonable from their perspective. A significant portion of Bitcoin-related fraud involves people being manipulated into transferring money to cryptocurrency platforms. Banks have a legal obligation to protect customers from this. When their systems see a large transfer to a crypto exchange, they cannot immediately distinguish between a deliberate investment and a scam victim being pressured to move funds. The problem is that this risk management approach treats every customer making a deliberate and informed decision as a potential fraud victim. It creates friction for legitimate users in order to protect victims of a completely different scenario. I asked what I could do to make future transfers smoother. The answer was essentially to call ahead for large amounts and be prepared to confirm the purpose of the transfer. Some banks have a process for adding specific exchanges to an approved list for a given customer. Mine did not at that time, but the representative said I could make a formal request to compliance. Here's what I found when I looked into this more broadly. Banks in the United States have varying policies on cryptocurrency purchases. Some have blocked certain exchanges entirely. Some apply enhanced review to all crypto-related transfers above a certain threshold. Some have no special restrictions. The variation is significant and not always publicly disclosed. You may not know your bank's policy until you hit it. The underlying reason is not that banks hate Bitcoin or that they are trying to protect the traditional financial system, though some critics make that argument. The primary driver is compliance cost and liability management. If a bank processes a transfer that turns out to be part of a fraud scheme, they face regulatory scrutiny and potential liability. Crypto-related fraud is common enough that it generates a disproportionate share of that exposure. From a pure risk management perspective, applying enhanced scrutiny to the entire category reduces that exposure. The secondary reason is more interesting. Some banks do have internal policies that go beyond pure fraud prevention. There is genuine institutional discomfort with cryptocurrency and parts of the traditional financial system. Whether that is competitive concern, regulatory uncertainty, or simply organizational conservatism varies by institution. But it exists. Here is what to do if your bank blocks a Bitcoin purchase. First, ask why it was blocked, then ask what their specific policy is for cryptocurrency transfers. Then ask whether there is an approval process for customers who want to make regular purchases. For large amounts, calling ahead before initiating the transfer can prevent the block from happening in the first place. If your bank is persistently obstructive despite that process, consider another funding route. Bitcoin-friendly institutions like River and Strike have different banking relationships and typically lower friction for purchase transactions. Wire transfer sometimes has a different friction profile than ACH at the same institution, and some exchanges accept debit card funding for smaller amounts, though fees are typically higher. The bank blocking your Bitcoin purchase is frustrating. It is also a useful reminder of something worth understanding about the financial system you are operating within. Your money sits in an account controlled by an institution that can and will apply rules to how you use it, for reasons that may have nothing to do with anything you have actually done wrong. Bitcoin, held in a wallet you control, operates by different rules. No bank or central intermediary can unilaterally authorize or prohibit a valid Bitcoin transaction on the network. The friction at the point of purchase is the last point where the traditional system can apply those rules. Once the Bitcoin is in your own wallet, those rules no longer apply. That is not a coincidence, it is the point. Quick recap before you go. My bank blocked a large Bitcoin purchase and flagged my account. Not because of anything I had done wrong, because transfers to cryptocurrency exchanges fall into a high-risk category in their fraud prevention framework. The reason is primarily compliance and liability management, not institutional hostility to Bitcoin, though that also exists in some cases. What to do? Call ahead for large purchases? Confirm you are making a deliberate decision. Ask about their specific policy and whether an approved exchange list is available. If your bank is persistently obstructive, Bitcoin-friendly alternatives exist, including River, Strike, and others with different banking relationships. The friction at the point of purchase is the last point where the traditional financial system can apply its rules. Once Bitcoin is in a wallet you control, those rules no longer apply. Understanding that distinction is part of understanding what Bitcoin actually is. If you want to understand why Bitcoin operating outside traditional financial control is both its defining feature and the reason institutions are uncomfortable with it, the video on why Bitcoin has value covers that from the ground up. Watch that next. Stack smart, stay curious. See you in the next stack.